Law in the court system. What is law? Let's take a few minutes to break down some legal terminology into ideas that normal people can understand. What is law? Law means many things to many people, and it really conjures up different ideas and different feelings when people think about what exactly law is. We think about Judge Judy, we think about Judge Dredd, we think about judges in courtrooms and on TV, and then we think about law enforcement, we think about people who make laws, and we think about vigilante justice. We even think about how bills become laws and the lawmaking process. Law is a rule of conduct or procedure which is agreed to or formally recognized as binding or enforced by a controlling authority. Is that a little bit of a confusing definition? Let's read it one more time. A rule of conduct or procedure which is agreed to or formally recognized as binding or enforced by controlling authority. Let's break down this definition. Law is either a rule of conduct or a rule of procedure. So it can be a rule of conduct which is agreed to, it can be a rule of conduct which is formally recognized as binding, or it can be a rule of conduct which is enforced by a controlling authority. Similarly, a rule of procedure can be agreed to, formally recognized as binding, or enforced by a controlling authority, and all of those ways are all laws. What are rules of conduct? Rules of conduct are rules which say to do or not to do something. We're very familiar with these. You can see them in criminal law, you can see them in whether or not to run a stop sign and what that means for you. You can see them in rules that are made in the classroom, like turning in your homework, or at the community swimming pool. They say you should do things or you should not do things. You should not, for example, run a red light. You should turn in your homework on time, and you should pay your taxes. Rules of procedure, on the other hand, are rules which describe the steps of doing something, so they all have some sort of order of operations. For example, you have to pass the 5th grade before going to the 6th grade. And in many homes, you have to eat your meal before you eat ice cream. Instead of saying what you should or shouldn't do necessarily, it gives you a process that you have to follow in order to get something done. Now you can have either rules of conduct or procedure which are agreed to. These, for example, would be playground games. They would be terms and conditions of websites. Anything which you are free to accept or reject. When you go onto a website and it asks you whether or not you want to agree with the terms and conditions of the website, you can choose to either click the little agree button at the bottom or to close the browser and walk away. Similarly, you can decide whether or not to play with your friends on the playground, or whether or not to apply for a credit card and then pay the APR which is charged to it. They can also be formally recognized as binding. Marriage contracts are a great example of this. Traffic rules and some written agreements, workers' compensation, car insurance, and assault laws. They are formally recognized by the government as something which is binding. For example, when you file a marriage certificate with the state in which you got married, the state formally recognizes the contract between the two individuals and binds them together in the bond of marriage. Similarly, there are written agreements which do the same thing when they're authorized by state actors, or when you enter into certain contracts which say that you have certain state-sponsored benefits, such as workers' compensation. The third way is that they are enforced by a controlling authority. The DEA, for example, enforcing a marijuana drug law. Classroom rules, which are enforced by a teacher and a principal. Even NBA regulations, which are enforced by really whatever the NBA regulatory body is, because I'm not quite sure. But whatever it is that makes sure that certain steroids aren't used, that courts are certain sizes, and that players maintain a certain level of professionalism in what they do and follow certain rules, would be the controlling authority in this case. You can also see these in company policies, and you can see these in Mama's House rules. because Mama, being the controlling authority, is going to make sure that those rules are enforced, no matter what you think of them and whether you agree to them or not. So this is what our pyramid looks like. A law is always going to be a rule, and then that rule can be a rule of conduct or it can be a rule of procedure. And then when you go down that pyramid, it can be a rule of conduct which is formally recognized as binding or enforced by a controlling authority, just like it can be a rule of procedure which is agreed to or formally recognized as binding.